Okay, in this video, we are going to talk about Nigeria's political economy. Uh, Once again, beware that you should be keeping this in the context of the larger issues that face developing world countries when they are trying to achieve development. We have already talked about Mexico, and I think would also be important to have that Mexican example in the back of your mind to compare and contrast it a bit to what happened in Nigeria. And again, Nigeria stands where Nigeria stands now. Now, look at Nigeria. We need to recognize that colonial economic development really didn't lay out any foundation for domestic business development. We have already talked about this, that modernization is a fairly new concern for the rest of the world, and certainly it was not something that colonies and empires thought about when they maintained colonies. They said, your job is to be subservient to us. So, for that reason, any kind of investment that happened came from the core, um, came from Britain or France or whatever country was investing there. So there was a very weak basis for private ownership in Nigeria. Uh, One of the larger businesses were owned by foreigners, and it's really kind of a sad, because the British, were quite willing to practice laissez-faire at home, where the government didn't have any control of businesses, but in its colonies there was pretty heavy state control. And again, it's that's one of the reason why US chose to opt out of this, why American colonies opted out of this 250 years ago. Another aspect of Nigeria's political economy, which was somewhat inherited, was this idea that one of the key resources that Nigeria could provide was to feed the empire. So, agricultural. But what the British really cared about was certain kind of things that could then be exported. So it wasn't so much fruits and things like that that were being produced, but it's kind of seeds that produce a lot of oil and things like that could be, and again that could be transported over time. That's not the thing you can eat on a daily basis. But despite this, local farmers were still able to make Nigeria fairly self sufficient. Now, a huge problem came right after independence. After independence, agriculture dropped from 80% of what Nigeria exported to only 2% of what it exported by 1980. Within 20 years, it had transformed so much that most of what it was exported via sea was not agriculture anymore. And this was due to the internal wars that had happened, some droughts and famine cycle for sure, but also like to say a very limited myopic tunnel vision on producing petroleum and nothing else, such that we saw the actually, it's ridiculous to think of it. In the 1960s, we saw starvation in Nigeria, a country which basically only existed to provide agriculture to the British Empire. But that's the way it was. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the evils of socialism. I mean, you might think from a bunch of university professor you're learning is socialism. But anyways, one of the things I really find always kind of funny is we are very quick to criticize socialism, but an average American doesn't understand it in the first place. And which makes it a kind of funny when certain policy proposals that are put forward by the current administration and are applauded just by the fact that they are socialism and government control or mercantilism. But here is an example for you. Let's take a look at an actual example, so that you can quote it and make your peers happy of how socialism can sometimes fail. So again, this is Nigeria. It's post-independence period. It's producing a lot of agriculture, and it says, okay, how can uh, we turn this to our advantage? We want to become more developed. Let's utilize this fantastic wealth that we have got in agriculture production to fuel our entire society's economic growth. Wow, that sounds great. What they did is establish something called Agriculture Marketing Board. Again, this is a state institution, and the idea was that rather than letting farmers export directly, they sell their goods to some private entity that then exports their goods to other countries. They said no, all the exports have to pass through this government owned institution on their way out to international market. And the reason that they want to do this is they would say, listen, the kind of things that we produce is agriculture, and the prices of staples such as agriculture, they fluctuate a lot. And that can lead to farmers making a good profit, but sometimes not making a good profit. To prevent that from happening, why don't we simply buy goods or buy the agricultural products from the farmers, give them a fair price, but not too high of a price, and especially in a good times, right? In good times, don't give them too much money, and with extra money, save it from extra money, save it for the rainy day when the prices for those products goes down. We can return it to farmers. That was the idea. We'll have saved a little bit and we can keep buying their agriculture products at a higher price. Going against the actual business cycle, counter cyclical. We'll buy it back from farmers at a higher price, protecting them from the fluctuations of the world market. So that was the idea. That sounds really good. So the idea was we will protect our farmers, we will skim a little bit of the extra to also fund the creation of infrastructure. I would have more roads, schools, hospitals. Well, that sounds great. That's the idea of socialism, right? Sharing that money, making decisions that will protect people from the unevenness of capitalism. Unevenness there, I don't mean that the inequality of capitalism, but I mean the fact that sometimes there is fast growth and slow growth, uh, right, to slow things down. But in reality, what happened was this agriculture marketing board was very, very corrupt, and it always brought low. It always gave the farmers very, very low price, then selling it for much higher on the market. And not much of that money was put in any kind of reserve to protect the farmers. And very little of it flowed into developing infrastructure or other kinds of industries. Instead, it was mostly embezzled. There was tremendous degree of corruption, and that led to this strategy to fail. And this, in a way, it failed. And it became so bad again that farmers had no incentive to produce. Remember the example I gave you in the class about the grades? They said, why produce when they are just going to rip us off, right? Let me enter into some other business because I'm going bankrupt here producing goods which I could try to sell elsewhere, where on a global market. I could get so much more money. But instead, I'm getting ripped off by this state institution that's buying these things off me at below market value. Now, that is, of course, the bane of Nigeria and its huge corruption problem. We just talked about uh, Agriculture Marketing Board, but let's look at in another context. So again, there was this idea, well, once the colonial empire left, we are going to industrialize on our own. And again, in the similar situation to Mexico, but even worse, there weren't a lot of people in Nigeria who had the money to buy a large company or any kind like that. So the government kind of had to own all these things, and this created a big problem. So there was a very close uh, relationship between business and government, but they weren't tempered by performance criteria, meaning they were allowed to continue simply because there were a lot of bribery going on and favoritism, but not because their business were anyway efficient. This brings us to the concept of rents. It's different from the concept of paying rent on a monthly basis. But rents are this idea that you have to invest certain something for your business to work. It might be bribes, or it might be simply be that you have to pay a lot of licensing fees and things of that nature, and get accreditation and things like that. Whatever the case, it's all those activities that you engage in as a business owner, which have nothing to do with business itself, but have to do with trying to be able to run your business, usually by trying to buddy up on, uh, get buddy up or get closer to the government. And so again, the government control this process. If you want to run a business, you have to apply for a permit, and at some point start to become less efficient and become more subject to corruption. So the irony is, in this country which is not well developed, there is a huge level of regulation. It is much more difficult to start a business in a developing world than in the US. In the US, maybe you got to fill out a zoning form, and you got to fill out your corporation form, but maybe it's three or four different forms. Uh, Sometimes but on the other hand, in some developing countries, you might be filling out 20 to 30 different forms, going to 15 different agencies, talking to 20 different civil servants, all of whom want some kind of fees and maybe a bribe on top of it for you to continue with that. It really discourages you from even starting a business in the first place. So it's a huge problem of being over regulated. And again, instead of focusing on market price of something, or whether your business is efficient, instead um, you are still continue to be able to do the business. Instead, the businesses are mostly focused on uh, presenting the best bribes to the government to ensure that they still continue to be able to be in the business. It's more about like the politics of business than the efficiency of business. A huge problem. And this, of course, leads to rather and actually registering your business in a official manner, instead having a huge informal sector. Lot of businesses that don't have the proper permits and things of that nature, and then they are not properly regulated, and surprise surprise, uh, if then they are producing goods that are dangerous or don't work well, it's because they are not regulated. Okay, that's Nigeria's situation.